Neil Patterson here with the Sky News Daily, and we've got two stories on our radar today. Later, Labour has big plans to sort out the huge issues in our water industry. But first, we return once again to Grenfell Tower. The inquiry published its final report yesterday. It concluded that every one of the 72 deaths was avoidable. So no surprise that the survivors and the bereaved are now desperate for justice. And for many of them, that means one thing: criminal convictions. But the police say they're 12 to 18 months away from passing files to the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS. Let's bring in Daw KC, barrister, legal commentator, author of Justice on Trial. Chris, we know that the Grenfell Inquiry pointed, several fingers of blame. So do you think there is any genuine prospect of criminal action? And if so, which particular offences?
Of course, there are possibilities of prosecution, principally, and the offence that the families are advocating for is for manslaughter, i.e. a crime which directly links to the cause of the deaths of those poor innocent people in that building. There are a number of other criminal offences which are less serious, connected with the quality of materials and more kind of technical offences, if you like, which result largely in very significant financial penalties, but not necessarily in people being sent to prisons.
Explain for our listeners the concept of corporate manslaughter, how a corporation can actually be criminally liable itself.
Corporations have a legal identity of their own, separate from their directors, their shareholders, and their employees. And that's been the case for many, many years since the idea of corporations was invented. When it comes to charging a corporation with a crime, it's incredibly difficult because you have to show that responsibility for that crime lay with someone who was what's described in law as one of the controlling minds of the business. So a very junior employee with no overall power or control to decide how the business is operated can't lead to the prosecution of the company as a whole. So often the problem is in corporate manslaughter investigations that the fault does lie with lower level employees, with operational employees, and the board of directors, the very senior management of the company, particularly when you're talking about global companies or global organizations, sit so far from that individual decision making that the authorities find it impossible to establish that the controlling minds were aware of, maybe enabled or allowed criminal behaviour to take place in the name of the company.
Speaking specifically about the Grenfell situation, why are the wheels of justice seemingly turning so slowly in all of this? 2017 was when the tower went up in flames. 2019, the Metropolitan Police said that they would be passing prosecution files to the CPS in late 2021. That has not happened. And we're now looking at a timescale of perhaps 12 to 18 months before even those files are handed to the CPS once again.
Well, the reason for that is systemic. Our criminal justice system as a whole is systemically underfunded and has partly, but not entirely as a result of COVID, a huge backlog in the system before the courts. And frankly, this sort of delay for a case of this complexity is par for the course. Every single day I'm dealing with cases where the events of the case, where the alleged crimes took place a decade or more ago. I recently finished a trial where the events took place between 2010 and 2012. The most tragic example of that delay lies with cases of rape and sexual violence, where the victims are waiting on average over 4 years to give evidence about a single incident of rape or sexual assault. And many of those cases, the vast majority of them, never get to court for one reason or another, including because victims just give up. So this is not just about Grenfell.
But look, back in 2020, the then Attorney General, Suella Braverman, in effect changed the rules so that answers given by witnesses to the inquiry couldn't be used in future criminal prosecutions. Does that make the job that much more difficult?
Well, it doesn't help because answers given on oath in a public inquiry, which are incriminating, are admissible in criminal proceedings. So she was legally wrong. The problem is that by someone who's occupying the office of Attorney General saying that in public, however ignorant and however ill-advised it was for her to say it, inevitably anyone who did give evidence and is accused of a crime, and anyone who perhaps made admissions in the course of their evidence which could have been used against them, is going to say, well, the Attorney General effectively gave me immunity or gave me the freedom to say whatever I liked without fear of that being used against me. That's simply not true.
But we have Sir Martin Bickmore's conclusion there in black and white. We know who he blames for those avoidable deaths. There will be people listening to us right now wondering what on earth was the point of the entire inquiry if those conclusions, those findings, don't immediately translate into the sort of punishment that, ends with a cell door being locked behind you.
Well, you make a very good point. Having heard the inquiry report setting out very, very clearly how those organisations and many individuals were personally or corporately responsible for those deaths, people will be thinking to themselves, well, job done. We now know what happened. We know who was to blame. Surely we just move on to punishing them. But the problem is that the criminal justice process is completely separate from the inquiry process. And this is one of our faults or failures as a society, where we're trying to ride two horses at once. An inquiry is intended to inquire into what happened and try and learn lessons for the future, whereas a criminal prosecution is intended to punish those who are criminally responsible for the events that took place. Those things are completely different. And a criminal trial, as everybody will be well aware, requires proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, whereas in an inquiry, there is no burden of proof. And I think we have to ask ourselves as a society, what's our priority here? Because the two things are in conflict.
Let's conclude by just focusing once again on what happened in Grenfell in 2017. Hand on heart, Chris, do you think that those who are calling for justice will ever see it?
From the evidence that I've seen, and one has to be careful to a degree because of the risk of prejudicing any potential future prosecution that may take place. But there are individuals who, through the evidence, have been revealed to have been deliberately withholding information about the fire risks attaching to claddings and the construction of Grenfell in a way that, in my view, as a criminal lawyer, looks to me like criminal behaviour, and which looks like there has been a deliberate cover-up in order to protect private interests and for profit. That's the sort of position that does lead to the prosecution of individuals, and if you can take it higher up the organisation, it can lead to prosecution of corporations. But will it happen, and when will it happen? I'm afraid history tells us it happens very rarely, and sad to say, I doubt very much whether the families will get what they want anytime soon.
Thanks, Chris.